Welcome back to the Holiness Podcast, where we believe when discipleship is our process, wholeness and holiness are the results. So glad that you're part of the conversation today as we celebrate living a Christian life. There are some resources at Pentecostal Publishing House that can help us in this journey, and we're thankful that Pentecostal Resources Group sponsors this podcast. You can use the coupon code TWP10 to get a 10% discount off of the resources available at the website. Thanks for being part of this conversation. Let's jump into the next episode. Welcome to the Holiness Podcast. We're so glad that you've joined us today. This season, we're digging into the topic of financial wholeness. And I'm so glad today to have our special guest, Eric Morley. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Brother Morley, you're Vice President of Operations at Finance here at Pentecostal Resources Group.
Right.
And we're friends and colleagues, and so I happen to know that you spend quite a bit of time every week working through all kinds of budgets and finances. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that as people are getting to know you here today?
Sure. Well, the Pentecostal Resources Group is one of the larger ministries here at UPCI headquarters. And so we have requirements to have an annual budget where we try to project what our revenue is going to be and also what our expenses are going to be, whether that's things like salaries and supporting the overhead of the building, the cost of printing, new books and new resources. So we have to try to put all of that into an annual budget that makes sense, that balances out, it helps us fulfill our role as a not-for-profit ministry of the United Pentecostal Church. So then day to day, of course, there could be dozens of transactions. We try to make sure those get accounted for properly. So I try to provide some oversight and leadership to a team, and we try to make that happen as part of the work that we do here at headquarters.
Yeah, and so I have the luxury that some of our viewers don't of getting to see this play out in real time every week, and so we're trying, I'm sure like a lot of our listeners and viewers in their own home, of balancing these sometimes competing values. We have this mission to create resources, we have this value of excellence, but we also have the value of stewardship. So we talk about stewardship here at Pentecostal Resources Group quite a bit, and then your team does a great job of figuring out how to live that out practically. So it's going to be interesting today as we talk about some Christian principles of finance. You're having the responsibility of dealing with that on a ministry-wide level, but then that certainly, I think, provides some talking points where you can speak to us on a personal level about just this concept of finances. We've talked about everything on this podcast, from mental and emotional wholeness to living our lives of service unto God. And I don't think it's a stretch then to talk about our finances and how pursuing what God wants for us in that aspect of our lives is part of His plan as well.
Yeah, depending on how you count it, many people have said that finances or stewardship of resources is one of the topics that the Bible talks most significantly about. Of course, in the Old Testament, in the Proverbs, into the parables of Jesus, and of course, in Paul's letters, even there's many places where he's talking about finances or stewardship of our resources even more broadly than just finances. So I think that living by certain principles is important if we're going to try to live a complete life, a holy life, a life that's available for service to the Lord. And what's interesting is so in my other work, I also serve as I am a licensed attorney and serve in the Air Force in the Reserve now, but was on active duty for several years. And so both in those different capacities, I meet with people who are going through difficult situations, who have a need for some sort of legal advice. And a significant portion of the time, it is connected to their financial situation, whether that's debt maybe that they've gotten into, or the aftermath of maybe other decisions they've made, or family situations that are causing financial strain and hardship. And so have had a chance to kind of see kind of both the big picture, the organizational side of finance, but then also try to work with people a little bit in a day-to-day basis and give them advice on how to navigate some of those challenges.
Yeah. Well, I may pick up on that and then say, obviously, our listeners, our viewers, they're probably coming from all kinds of walks of life, and everyone's situation is probably unique. But I do think that's helpful to remember that our finances can become a huge part that dictates our happiness, our fulfillment, and we've all probably at some season been through a time of financial strain, and it certainly has ripple effects in every area of our lives. So if we can learn some principles today that help us put ourselves in a healthier place financially, I think it just has all kinds of positive effects across our life, our family, our relationships. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's in Psalm 24 where it talks about how the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And so I think anytime you're talking about finances, we need to remember that it all belongs to the Lord, and we want to keep the Lord first in our
Amen.
finances. So I think in a very practical application, um, you know, tithing, I
Right.
think is biblical. I think it's the plan and the pattern for the church and for ministry. And so um, whenever I've had a chance to talk to young people, I encourage them to just start doing that
Yeah,
early. The first time,
that's right.
you get a job making, um, I was going to say $10 an hour. Of course, things have probably changed, but you just start there, and then
Yeah,
you set
yeah,
try to set that pattern for your life,
yeah,
and then also being generous then when you
sure.
can, in offerings and in
Yeah,
other ways, being available to give
yeah.
when there are needs.
Yeah, somebody can probably work backwards right now, and there's probably some website they've plugged this in, and they're like, "Oh, so you are this many years old." I remember, first job, and minimum wage was 5.15, and when it went up to 5.25, I was like, "Look at this! The Lord's blessing. I'm rich."
Yeah,
Well, life has changed a bit since then, and but you're right. Those principles, life has this way of making you feel like wherever you are right now, that's normal. And sometimes you lose sight of where you were a few years back, and we don't know what's to come in the future. But I think that's really great advice that start wherever you are, observing these principles, and then it's just the way we live. It's not a,
yeah.
a, a big stretch then once we have these principles in place.
Yeah. And, and I was blessed growing up to have parents that provided for our family,
Yeah,
um, and set a great example and a pattern. And I think um, I just speak for myself, as a man, as a husband,
sure.
as a father, I think one of the principles try to live by is, providing for my family, providing for
Right.
my household. I think that
Yeah.
Paul talks about that in Timothy chapter 5, verse 8,
Right.
and in Second Thessalonians chapter 3,
Right.
verse 10. And I think those are just
Yeah.
good principles that are important to instill from a young
Right.
age, that if we're going to support ourselves and support a family, we've got to be
Yeah.
inclined to do that and willing to do that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is a good point to celebrate all those families out there working hard to make
Yeah,
sometimes tough decisions, figuring
absolutely.
out the appropriate steps for a family. Um, but I am grateful that Scripture. You brought up how often Scripture speaks about our finances, and I'm really glad for that because that provides direction in those moments when we're trying to figure out how to make decisions and figure out what's best for the family. I'm glad that we have that direction. So those are some great passages that you've pointed out. You mentioned that word generosity, and I think sometimes that word sounds like it would be pretty spontaneous, but I think there's probably an aspect to planning, even with this idea of I want to be a generous person. That itself could be something that we plan for.
I think so. I think having that availability in our lives to be generous when we're encountering a need, or when we see a ministry or a need that we want to be part of, and planning to be able to give maybe in a more significant way. I think one of the passages of scripture about this that I think is so interesting is that Philippians chapter 4. And there's that verse, I think it's chapter 4, verse 19, where Paul says, "But my God shall supply all of your needs according to his
Right.
riches and glory." And we love to quote that verse because it's just like a general verse of blessing. But when you really read about the 6 or 7 verses above that, what Paul's really talking about is, hey, I've been traveling, I've been spreading the gospel, I've been doing this, what we would call missions work,
Sure.
and I've had times where I've had need. I mean, he said, I wanted you to give, not just to fulfill my needs, but to be a blessing to you. And you guys have stepped up and have provided for my needs. And because you've supplied my needs, I believe God's going to supply
Yeah.
yours. So again, there was intentionality, and there was
Right.
planning that went along with the generosity of those churches that were supporting
Yeah.
Paul, and that was going to allow blessing in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And that might practically for us look like planning for certain periodic projects that we would
Sure.
maybe want to give to as a family. Many of our listeners and viewers probably attend maybe a United Pentecostal church, and we have certain offerings that we know that the church will be involved in annually. And so I think we can do both. We can see a need and
Right.
respond in the moment, but then also if we have the discipline to go ahead and plan for some of these offerings that we know our local church will participate in, I think
Right.
there's wisdom in that planning. And then of course that passage, I love that this idea that the body is kind of taking care of one another through the blessing of finance.
Absolutely. And I think, too, not to shift too much,
Yeah, sure.
but I think one of the things that can be hard sometimes when we want to be generous is, of course, this will get into budgeting, but it's a lot of times really about debt. And,
Yeah.
just to be transparent about it and blunt about it, in America, we're very blessed
Hmm.
materially. There's a lot of opportunity, and, there's this notion of, hey, we want to earn money and have a good lifestyle, and obviously we need to take care of ourselves and take care of our family, but sometimes that can fall into debt.
Sure.
And there's been discussions before about how there's categories of good debt and there's bad
Yeah.
debt, and then there's things like student loans and people saying, is that good debt, is that bad debt?
Sure.
There's financial advisors out there who say you should never have any type of debt. Again, so all those discussions are a little bit beyond kind of,
Yeah.
you know, just kind of general principles. But um, I'm going to have to look to get the exact reference. It's Proverbs 22:7. And I always think that verse is so helpful because it talks about how the borrower is a servant to the lender. And
Very
I think
true.
what that means in practical terms is when you're in debt,
Mhm.
the money that you're earning today and tomorrow isn't paying for today and tomorrow's needs or today and tomorrow's opportunities, whether
Sure.
those are investments or a way to give generously. They're paying for decisions that you made in the past,
That's very true.
or experiences or expenditures you had in the
Yeah.
past. Um, and again, I'm not saying all debt is always bad. Certainly, there are times where it's just, I'll even, a few years ago, I needed to do some improvements on my home and
Sure.
went into a little bit of debt for that, but evaluated that as, hey, does this have a long-term benefit? Is this something
Sure.
that's actually going to benefit me now and in the future?
Right.
So we need to be careful about that, is my point. And
Right. Right.
because the decisions we've made in the past kind of tie our hands
Yeah.
in the present with debt.
Yeah. No, that's a great verse to really back up that principle of trying to find the right fit as a family. It's like you referenced. There are certain people, and finance is certainly not my specialty. I don't set this season up as to be the expert here. You're going to find some of these, self-proclaimed experts, and genuinely some experts who have that expertise, and they're going to have that. Yeah, they're going to have that.
Mhm.
This is the system. You must do this, and
Right.
don't do this. Um, I think you're right to say each person's situation is unique, and they've got to figure out what works for them based on their needs and the details surrounding that
Sure.
unique situation. But that is true about a good principle when we're saddled with debt. It really does just overwhelm us and really affect us. And it's so interesting that in America, you're right to point out with North America, we have so many blessings,
Right.
and just really connected to that is the opportunity in enjoying so many material
Right.
things. We can lose sight of the long-term complications of acquiring debt and the pressure that adds to a household.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to go back again to that verse talking about the borrower being servant to the lender, really when we're in debt, we're making our present
Yeah,
a servant to the past
that's
because
very
we're
true.
working today
Yeah,
to pay for yesterday's
yeah,
decisions and choices. And again,
yeah.
not saying that all debt is always
Sure.
bad. That's a little bit beyond the scope, I think, of the principle. But
Right.
we want to try to live
Yeah.
in a way that is forward-looking
Right.
in our
Right.
finances.
Right. And maybe if there's someone out there watching or listening, and you are coping with debt for a variety of reasons, maybe this season on the podcast is just an opportunity for you to take a fresh look at that. I'm sure in your local community, you can find the appropriate people that you could speak with to help you do some financial planning and some management to figure out how you can take some steps forward. But I think it's so helpful to really drive home today this point of be cautious about taking
Sure.
on debt. Again, there are those times where it's appropriate, but we have to use
Right.
balance and wisdom
Right.
in those decisions. Well, maybe for those that are thinking big picture, part of what maybe would help us avoid unnecessary debt is proper planning.
Right.
Budgeting, that's a word that, maybe people out there, we say budget and they immediately think, oh, yes, and they can point to something very specific they've already set up. Maybe there are others who've not quite got around to that step.
Yeah.
In your experience, what's that like? You work with budgets on an organization level, I'm sure on a personal level. What are some principles that you think help with budgeting?
I think budgeting is fundamentally about planning and it's
Mhm.
about priorities.
Yeah.
And so when you do take time to budget, um, you are allowing yourself to look at things more holistically and more big picture. And so I think when you do budget, having some money set aside for emergencies for
Sure.
whenever you do have a car repair or an appliance goes out. So you're not having to go into debt, but you have a little
Right.
bit of money at least set aside to cover that short term emergency. I think that's an important aspect of budgeting. And then, again, some people with budgeting, they recommend you have a spreadsheet and you tie down every single
Yeah.
penny. And certainly that is helpful and appropriate in some cases. But also, making sure you've got the big things
Yeah.
taken care of. Um, you're tithing because that's the first thing you want to do. So even before you set out a budget, you could say, you want to make sure you have your tithing and your giving
Yeah.
set up. But make sure you're covering your big expenses like your housing, and your utilities, and then your transportation. But if you get those big things set up, and then a lot
Yeah.
of times the smaller things
Yeah.
will follow.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I know often here I'll kind of use our PRG conversation
Mm,
since that's a common point here. You really have two options. You can lower your spending, or
right,
you can try to increase your income. Ultimately it's coming down to those two things. And I think sometimes just the act of sitting down and looking at the budget, even if, like you say, you don't put every single dollar earmarked to the certain
right,
direction, I think just that exercise of periodically reviewing, what's going out, what am I spending? Does that look healthy? Does that
right,
look appropriate? And then, let's be realistic about what we can realistically expect to come in our income. I think sometimes just that act of stopping and looking, it might help us self-correct if we are starting to spend maybe frivolously. And then there may be seasons where we know with some kind of anticipated expense, maybe we do find some kind of way to help our income for a season if we realize that that's going to be a necessity. But it's that discipline of sitting down periodically and looking at that, taking inventory to realize that. And I guess what I'm just saying is we don't want to wait until we're already in a difficult
right,
place. We gotta take inventory pretty frequently.
right. And I think for a lot of people that could be on a monthly basis or even a
Sure.
quarterly
Sure.
basis to kind of check in and see, okay,
Yeah.
where am I doing well and where am I a little bit
Yeah.
off track.
Yeah.
And then do I have any major expenses or major investments coming up that I'm going to
Absolutely.
need to make?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, sometimes, emergencies are emergencies because
Hmm.
they can't be predicted. So even in our planning, thinking about that and what does it look like to be prepared, I appreciated you referencing that. If we've got just a little bit of room for when that unexpected
Right.
happens, having something so we're not immediately just if we've got that budget so tight that if one unexpected thing happens, we've got no plan for that. That puts us in some of that financial strain that can be really tough on relationships in a household.
Yeah, it can. And I think I saw a study maybe last year that said, I may have some of the numbers off, but like your average American household would have a hard time covering either a $500 or $1,000 unanticipated expense.
Wow.
And of course, a car repair or,
Sure.
replacing an appliance
Yeah.
or, a home repair can
Right.
easily
Yeah.
get into that. And so having some sort
Yeah.
of plan for, an
Yeah.
emergency,
Yeah.
I think is something that we should all strive for.
Yeah, I think today these are just really just good practical tips. Just a lot of wisdom in this, and we've referenced North America quite a bit. And you know, there are certainly all kinds of even political opinions about where things are with
Right.
finance and the economy, and I certainly don't want to get into that. But I just want to make the point that we've got to take some initiative and be proactive for exactly those reasons. If something unexpected comes up, and it just will. Life has that way of plan
Right.
for the unplanned because it's very likely to happen. But again, I'm grateful that we've got wisdom from the Word of God and stewardship to be able to be proactive in these conversations and use basic biblical principles to do that.
Yeah. One of the changes that we all will face at some point um, in our lifespan is retirement.
Yeah, that's true. That's very
Um,
true.
and the way our economy is set up is you really have to start saving for retirement early in your working years.
Yeah.
Um, and so, what I encourage when we get a new employee on our team here at PRG, or if someone asks my opinion, I encourage them, as soon as you start earning
Yeah.
money, set a percentage of that aside for retirement. If your
Absolutely.
employer provides a match,
Hmm.
try to take full advantage of that as soon as possible. Because that's essentially a 100% return on your investment, or
Right.
50%, depending on how that employer has that ratio set up.
Yeah.
Um, and start early so you get the value of that compound interest and that time. And then the other thing is um, when you can, if you get a raise or if you get, um, you know, um, a promotion or something like that, is increase
Yeah.
that percentage. And so if you
Yeah.
start out at 5% and then for the next 5 years you increase by 1%, well,
Yeah.
it doesn't take that long and you're already saving 10, and then depending on the match, 15, eventually
Sure.
20% of your income
Sure.
to retirement, and you've done that incrementally.
Hmm.
And so there's a power of compound interest, but there's also the power of
Yeah.
incremental increase in retirement, because
Yeah.
if the Lord tarries and if we live, all of us are going to face,
Right.
that retirement,
Right. Yeah.
that change
Yeah.
in our working lives, if you will.
Yeah, that's great advice. There are some things that if I make the decision right now, I can just go ahead and do it, and it's a low pressure
Hmm.
decision. Whatever I decide to eat for lunch, I can decide that as I'm walking out the door. That's not a high pressure decision, but something like that is a very time sensitive decision. If I wait until I'm
Right.
in my senior season of life and then go, oh, I should really think about this, it's very difficult because that the time has really passed to be able to
Right.
make that decision with enough time to really to have fruition.
Yeah.
So
And
that's good
again, a
advice.
little bit beyond the scope of maybe our discussion today, but there are
Sure.
tax benefits too to saving
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
retirement.
Hmm.
Based on the type of contribution you make,
Yeah.
and depending on your income, there can even be a
Sure.
tax credit. So all of that, of course, takes some planning,
Yeah.
but just starting and
Yeah.
then reevaluating it every year or 6 months. Then can
Absolutely.
I make an increase?
Absolutely. I think this is such good advice. I hope our listeners and viewers, it may be that much of what we're saying, you're going, yep, check, I'm doing that. Yep, check, I'm doing that. And I hope so because it really gives us then the freedom to live our lives um, in missional ways because we're not so, you reference individuals who found themselves in such difficulty that it does dictate their future. And I think part of the value of financial stewardship is then knowing those things are taken care of and that they're functioning in healthy ways. We can then look to other areas of our lives that, be it our service in church or so forth, that we can do without the pressure of financial strain, I suppose is what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that I noticed as we were kind of planning for this conversation, while a lot of what you may be hearing today is something that would kind of just be general um, principles that maybe wouldn't be necessarily apostolic. I do appreciate that one of the things that you recognize is we do need to be careful of things that can drain our
Mm,
efforts to plan and be wise with our finances. So whether
yeah.
that would be, vices, certainly there are times where just our failure to plan can have an
Right.
adverse effect. But sometimes there are even things that our society would maybe say this isn't really a big deal, but we know this can really disrupt a family or an individual's ability to plan.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that. I would say that within my lifetime, um, the idea of gambling,
Sure, sure.
you know, uh, specifically legalized gambling, was kind of limited to certain. I remember as a kid, like there was Atlantic City and there was Las Vegas that you
Sure.
heard of these things. And of
Yeah.
course, states had lotteries,
Yeah.
but I think um, holiness churches, Pentecostal churches, conservative Christians, however you want to define that, for generations have taught that gambling
Yeah.
is a bad idea because it's a vice, it's a waste of money, it's it can be addictive, it can be
Mhm.
habit forming, it can be detrimental to a family, and I even saw
Sure.
that in some of the legal work that I
Oh,
did,
sure. Yeah.
trying to help people who had
Yeah.
created allowed those problems to creep into their lives. But what's really changed in the last 4 or 5 years is this explosion of sports
Yeah.
gambling
Right.
and it becoming
Yeah.
nationwide and something that people can do on their phones. And so
Sure.
I don't know if uh, young people that are coming up today have all of that background of how unusual that really is, because we're recording this in late October. So right now,
Yeah.
like all the major sports are in season: college football, the World Series,
Sure.
the NFL, like all those things. All of the commentary and the sports discussion that has always been out there is now just like embedded with gambling to talk about, which team is favored by how many,
Sure.
you know,
Sure.
points and stuff like that, stuff I don't even always completely understand when you hear it,
Right.
but it's just become embedded in,
Yeah.
people that follow sports are going to hear
Yeah.
about that gambling, and it's become so easy to do. And it just, in the last, I think, really 5 years has just exploded. But it can be such a drain because it can be, it can be addictive. It can be detrimental. In fact, there was a study recently that came out where they looked at places that have kind of I don't know if it was counties or if they followed families, but they tried to follow the impact of it. And for every dollar that was spent on gambling, there was a $2 reduction in what that family was saving. There was a decrease in the credit scores, an increase in the prevalence of bankruptcy. So society, I think, is recognizing that there really is a cost here, which is why I think the teaching we've always had to stay away from gambling is kind of proving itself out.
Yeah. There's wisdom in that. A lot of times it's interesting, especially we kind of tie this concept of holiness into this podcast. Sometimes it's easy to just look at a specific topic and think, what's the big deal about that? But I think you're right to pull out even those contemporary studies that are helping us see, wow, there are these adverse effects. And so there's always that reason behind some of the positions we take on certain issues. And it's healthy like this in a conversation to bring it up and situate it in this context of a conversation about, if we want to be able to serve God in the most ways possible, what are the things in life that can inhibit us being able to live healthy lives? And so that's a great example of something that could become very problematic for an individual or family.
Yeah, and so people have to decide where to draw that line. For some people, probably not going to want to follow sports as closely because it has just become so ingrained. But I think just wasting our money on lotteries and sports gambling and sports betting and all the different avenues that are out there is just don't give that place in your heart and your life.
Yeah, we're back to kind of on that practical side. What's your income? What are you spending? And I think we have to recognize in that case that's a definite spend. The odds are literally against us. So what are those healthy ways that we can use the resources that God has given us in a productive, healthy way? I was maybe over the weekend having a conversation with someone. And, in the same way as we were talking about tithing earlier, when we really understand that everything put in our hands is really God's, then that does kind of limit, not in a negative way, but in a healthy way. It limits what I am going to do with those funds, because if I really view it as God has entrusted me with this, it's more His than mine. And so that does kind of guide the way that we do take care of the money that we have.
Yeah, we want that to be set apart, from the world and unto God. And we see that in stewardship and taking care of our needs and our family's needs, but then also, having that available to bless the kingdom.
Absolutely. There are very real parallels with our physical temple, and the way we take care of our physical body, and then in the way the resources that we've been given, like our funds. So this has been such I think, a helpful conversation. Really appreciate your time today to be part of the episode. And I know those who are watching and listening have been blessed by it. Maybe just to close us out, would there be any final advice, if you want to kind of just sum things up and maybe give an overview or takeaway for our listeners or viewers out there on this topic of healthy financial stewardship?
I think the biggest thing is to get the big things right. So, in our tithes and our offerings, in providing for ourselves and our families, and, for retirement. And then if you do the big things, that's the best way you can kind of set yourself up for your own
Yeah.
success and wholeness, and to be available then to bless the kingdom.
Yeah, so good, so good. Well, I want to say thank you, Brother Morley, for being part of this
Yeah,
conversation
thank you.
today. Yeah, I know it's going to be a blessing out there for all of you who have joined us today. We appreciate your investing in this conversation because I know it has dividends in the way that we can live out fuller, healthier lives. So we appreciate everyone joining today. Stay tuned for more from the Holiness Podcast.